As the small spacecraft touched down on the abandoned alien ship, the atmosphere felt unnervingly still. The hatch of the ship opened with a low hiss, and the protagonist, feeling both curious and uneasy, stepped out onto the cold metal floor. The inside of the ship was dark, with only the faint glow of distant, broken lights casting strange shadows across the walls. The ship had been lost for centuries, and it was clear that time had taken its toll. The air inside was thick, musty, and stale, as if it hadn't been disturbed for ages. Every creak and groan of the ship echoed in the silence, amplifying the feeling of isolation. As they cautiously moved deeper into the ship, the protagonist couldn't help but feel a chill crawl down their spine. The walls were covered in unfamiliar, glowing symbols, alien hieroglyphs that seemed to pulse faintly, as though alive. The air was cold, but there was an odd warmth in the strange, flickering lights. The ship, despite its obvious decay, seemed to hum with a strange, low energy. It was as if something was waiting, watching, or perhaps alive. They walked through narrow corridors lined with dust-covered windows that opened into dark, empty rooms. Some of the rooms had doors that were half open, showing signs of life that had long since vanished. A few doors had strange markings etched into them, symbols that seemed to glow and shift, making the protagonist hesitate before moving forward. The deeper they went, the more it seemed like the ship was designed to trap those who entered. The hallways twisted and turned, with no clear direction to where they were headed. It felt like they were being drawn further in, unable to resist the pull of the unknown. Finally, they reached a large central chamber. The room was enormous, and in the center stood an array of control panels and alien machinery. Dust and grime covered everything. But there were also signs of something else, like faint traces of movement, scratches on the metal, and strange residue that seemed to glow softly. The protagonist approached the central console cautiously, taking a deep breath. A soft, eerie sound seemed to emanate from the console, like the quiet hum of the ship's lifeblood. The machines looked old, but strangely well-maintained, as if someone, or something, had been taking care of them despite the ship's abandonment. They couldn't help but feel like they were not alone. Their hands hovered over the control panel, unsure of what to do next. The language on the screen was foreign, but there were a few symbols they recognized. Fuel. The ship was running low on fuel, and it seemed like the system might be salvageable. If they could just get it working, they could refuel and escape. But as they reached to activate the system, the lights in the room flickered violently. The hum of the machines grew louder, almost as if they were waking up. Suddenly, a loud clanging sound echoed from the darkness behind them. It wasn't the sound of metal scraping on metal. It was something else, something far too organic. The protagonist froze. Their heart raced as the noise grew louder, closer. There was no time to run. They had to act quickly. Looking back at the console, they quickly began trying to activate the refueling system. But as their fingers touched the panel, a loud, shrill scream echoed from somewhere deep inside the ship. The sound was unnatural, like 1,000 voices crying out in pain. The protagonist spun around, eyes wide with fear, but the source of the scream was nowhere to be seen. Only shadows and silence greeted them. Still, the air felt heavier, as if something had just awakened. Desperately, they tried again, this time bypassing the system's locks. The alien technology was strange and hard to understand, but with some effort, they managed to get a fuel gauge to display on the screen. It was low, but enough to get the ship moving again. That was all that mattered. However, as the fuel system activated, something strange began to happen. The ship itself seemed to shudder. The lights blinked erratically, and the walls seemed to breathe, shifting and groaning. Then the most unsettling thing happened. A cold gust of wind rushed through the room, pushing against the protagonist's back. It felt like it was alive, like the ship itself was trying to warn them, or worse, keep them there. The door to the chamber slammed shut behind them, locking them in. Panic set in. What had they triggered? What was it that they had disturbed by turning on the fuel system? There was no time to think. The protagonist rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Something, or someone, was on the other side, holding it shut. The lights flickered again, and the ship's hum grew louder. Then came a voice, a whisper so faint that it seemed to come from everywhere at once. It was a language they couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Warning. A shiver ran down the protagonist's spine as the whisper turned into a low guttural growl. Something in the ship was alive, and it wasn't happy to see them. They quickly moved to the control panel again, trying to find another way to open the door or complete the refuel process faster. But just as they did, the lights went out completely, and the whole ship went into darkness. A deep, unsettling silence followed, only broken by the distant, eerie sound of something scraping against metal. It was getting closer. The protagonist's pulse quickened. They needed to leave, and they needed to leave now. But with every step, the sense of being followed, watched, and hunted grew stronger. The refueling process wasn't the only thing that had been activated. The alien ship was alive, and it was reacting to their presence. It was no longer abandoned. It was a trap, and they had just walked right into it. The silence was suffocating as the protagonist ventured deeper into the heart of the abandoned alien ship. The walls, covered in strange symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, felt like they were watching, observing every move. The air was stale, filled with the scent of rust and decay, as if the ship had been untouched for centuries. It felt as though time itself had been frozen in this eerie vessel, and yet something about it felt off. Each step echoed through the hollow corridors, and the protagonist couldn't shake the feeling of being drawn into something far greater than they had anticipated. The corridors were narrow, winding, and disorienting, as if designed to confuse or trap anyone who dared enter. The walls seemed to move and shift subtly, their once smooth surfaces now marred by scratches and cracks. The deeper they moved, the more the feeling of unease settled in, like a cold hand on their shoulder. As the protagonist moved cautiously through the halls, they noticed small signs of something or someone having been there recently. There were scuff marks on the floors, as if something heavy had been dragged across the metal surface. Strange residue clung to the walls, glowing faintly as if it were alive. It wasn't dust, but something else, something organic. It sent a shiver down their spine. They had to keep moving forward, but every instinct screamed for them to turn back. At last they reached a massive central chamber, its high ceilings stretching far above them, swallowed by shadows. The room was filled with a strange mechanical hum that seemed to vibrate through the air. In the center of the chamber stood a massive control console, surrounded by rows of alien technology. The screens were cracked, and wires hung loosely from the walls. But there was something active about the place. The protagonist couldn't explain it, but they felt a strange pulse, as if the ship itself were alive, breathing. Moving toward the console, they hesitated for a moment, their fingers brushing against the dusty surface. The alien symbols on the screen flickered to life, glowing bright blue for a brief moment before turning back to static. The protagonist glanced around, trying to make sense of the foreign language flashing on the screen. It was no use. The symbols were completely unreadable, but one word stood out, a glowing line of symbols that looked like a fuel gauge. Fuel. They needed fuel. That was the reason they had come here. They just needed to refuel the ship and get back to safety. The protagonist's fingers trembled as they hovered over the console, trying to activate the system. The buttons felt cold beneath their touch, but with a few attempts, they managed to get a flickering display to show up. The fuel levels were dangerously low, but there was enough to power up the ship for a quick getaway. Relief flooded their chest, but it was short-lived. As soon as they activated the system, the entire ship seemed to shudder. The lights above flickered violently, and the room seemed to warp, as though the walls were closing in. The hum of the machines grew louder, more insistent. The protagonists spun around, their heart racing. They had done something, triggered something. The air around them became thick, oppressive, and the strange, eerie feeling intensified. It was as though the ship had reacted to the command, waking from its long slumber. Suddenly, there was a noise, low, guttural, and bone-chilling. A scraping sound echoed from the far side of the chamber, followed by the unmistakable sound of something heavy dragging along the floor. The protagonist's eyes widened in terror, scanning the room for the source of the noise, but saw nothing. It was coming from behind them, somewhere deep within the ship. The air turned colder, and the temperature dropped sharply. The protagonist's breath fogged in front of them as they began to back away slowly. A whisper echoed through the chamber, soft, almost imperceptible at first. It sounded like a warning, but it wasn't in any language the protagonist recognized. It was a strange, alien murmur, almost like a song, but twisted and distorted. The voice seemed to be coming from all around, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. The protagonist's pulse quickened, but there was no turning back now. They needed to finish what they had started. Just as they were about to return to the console, the lights flickered again, and the temperature dropped even further. Then the voice became clearer, louder, and more urgent. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was a scream, a terrible, soul-piercing scream that seemed to come from deep within the ship itself. The protagonist's body went cold with fear. They were not alone. In that moment, the door to the chamber slammed shut, sealing them inside. The air became thick, almost suffocating, and the mechanical hum grew deafening. The protagonist's hands shot out to the door, but it was no use. It was locked. Something was holding it shut, something powerful, something alive. The ship was not abandoned. It was waiting. And now, it had woken. Panicked, the protagonist rushed to the control panel, trying to override the lockdown, but the system was unresponsive. The screens flickered erratically, displaying strange symbols that made no sense. The machine was fighting back, as if it were trying to prevent them from leaving. The protagonist's thoughts raced. They needed to get out, fast. But just as they tried to escape, the walls of the chamber began to move. The entire room seemed to twist, like the ship itself was shifting, warping around them. The protagonist turned around in a panic, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of danger, but saw nothing. Then, from the darkness, they heard it. A low, guttural growl, like something breathing, something waiting. The protagonist's heart pounded in their chest as they frantically looked for a way out. The lights went out completely, plunging them into complete darkness. The sound of the growl grew louder, and the air was thick with a strange, unnatural tension. They couldn't escape. Not now. The ship had come alive, and it was not letting them go grace, their movements fluid and predatory, as if they were nothing more than shadows given form. Every step they took echoed through the chamber, their elongated limbs scraping against the metal floor. The protagonist's heart hammered in their chest, fear rushing through their veins. The growling sound intensified, now coming from multiple directions, and it wasn't just a growl. It was almost like a chorus of voices, all overlapping, whispering in an alien language that sent a cold shiver down their spine. The protagonist's mind raced. They had to get out, but the ship was alive, its hulls twisting and contorting around them. Every direction felt wrong. Every corner could hide another monster. The control panel's glowing screen mocked them, still offering the fuel readout that showed just how close they were to escape, if only they could reach it. But the creatures were closing in. One of them, larger than the others, stepped forward. Its eyes, if you could even call them that, seemed to lock onto the protagonist with an unsettling intensity. A deep, low growl rumbled in its chest, and the ship seemed to respond to its presence, the walls vibrating as though it, too, recognized the danger. The creature's skin was translucent, and veins of bioluminescence pulsed beneath the surface, lighting up the room in a grotesque, sickly green. The protagonists stumbled backward, their breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. They needed to think, needed to get out, but their legs felt like lead. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but the corridors had become a labyrinth of death. The monsters were everywhere. The shadows in the corners shifted, and the soft scraping sound of their feet dragging across the floor sent a new wave of panic through the protagonist's mind. In that moment, the protagonist realized something. The ship wasn't just a vessel. It was a trap, and they had triggered something they weren't supposed to. The creatures weren't just random survivors. They were guardians. Guardians of the ship. The ship had been waiting, dormant for centuries, and now it was awake, and it wasn't going to let the protagonist leave. The protagonist backed into the control console, desperately trying to make sense of the alien technology. The ship's hum had changed. It was no longer the gentle vibration they had felt before. It had turned into something dark and threatening. The energy that pulsed from the walls now seemed to emanate from the creatures themselves. They were feeding off the ship's power, and it was clear that their mission was to keep intruders, like the protagonist, trapped forever. The largest of the creatures lurched forward, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it lunged toward the protagonist. In that instant, instinct took over. The protagonist spun, grabbing the nearest piece of debris, a jagged shard of metal, and used it to pry open the control panel. Sparks flew, and the panel sparked violently, but the fuel gauge flickered, indicating that it was finally about to complete the refueling process. The escape was so close, yet, in that moment, the danger was even greater. The creature was nearly upon them now, its claws scraping across the floor, reaching for the protagonist. Panic surged in their chest. They couldn't wait any longer. With a final, desperate push, the protagonists slammed their hand onto the console, forcing the refueling process to complete. The ship shook violently, and the lights flickered back on, brighter this time. The ship was awakening, fully powered, but it wasn't the peaceful hum from before. It was something far more dangerous. The entire vessel felt alive with energy, almost like it was reacting to the impending escape. With one last look at the grotesque, shadowy figures closing in, the protagonist leaped toward the exit. The ship seemed to respond, its corridors suddenly twisting even more violently, as if to stop them from escaping. The door to the chamber slammed shut behind them, but they didn't have time to stop. The monsters were closing in, and the only thing that mattered now was getting back to the ship and leaving the cursed place behind. The protagonist burst through the doors of the central control room and sprinted down the corridors, not daring to look back. The ship was alive, its heart was beating, and it didn't want them to leave. As they neared the docking bay, the ship's walls seemed to close in around them, the shadows growing longer and the growls louder. Their breath came in ragged gasps as they finally reached the docking bay and jumped into their own ship. Just as the hatch slammed shut, the loud screeching sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the air. The protagonist's heart raced. They couldn't afford to hesitate now. With trembling hands, they activated the thrusters, the ship's engines roaring to life, pulling them away from the cursed alien vessel. As the small ship rose into the sky, they couldn't shake the feeling that the alien ship was still watching, following, alive. The stars outside were quiet, but in the silence of space, the protagonist knew that the horror they had just escaped was far from over. The creature's eyes still burned in their memory, and the ship's haunting, low hum seemed to linger in their ears. They had escaped, but they couldn't help but wonder if the ship was waiting for them to return, or if it was just beginning a hunt of its own. As the protagonist's ship tore through the cold vacuum of space, leaving the abandoned alien vessel behind, a strange unease settled in their chest. The hum of their own ship's engines, though familiar and comforting, couldn't shake the feeling that they had escaped something far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. The stars outside were endless, quiet, too quiet, and the vastness of space felt almost suffocating. The protagonist glanced over their shoulder half expecting to see the alien ship looming in the distance, its shadow stretching across the stars. But the black void behind them was empty, calm. The alien ship, with its eerie, otherworldly hum, was no longer visible. Relief washed over them, but it was a fleeting sensation. Something gnawed at the back of their mind, a lingering dread they couldn't explain. They had escaped, yes, but at what cost? The creatures, the whispers, the unnatural energy of the ship. They had felt alive, and the protagonist knew in their gut that the alien ship wasn't finished with them. It wasn't just a ship. It was something far more complex, something with a purpose. Perhaps it was watching, waiting for them to make a mistake, or maybe, just maybe, it was following them. The protagonist quickly turned their attention to the control panel in front of them, focusing on the flight path to navigate away from the cursed ship. But their hands trembled as they gripped the controls, their thoughts racing. They couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, deeply wrong. Had they truly escaped, or was this just the beginning of something much worse? The flight path was set, the ship's thrusters roaring as they pushed forward. The familiar hum of the engines did little to comfort them now. The protagonist's gaze flicked to the communications panel. No signal. It wasn't unusual, but today it felt ominous. They tried again, tapping at the controls. Silence. They were alone in the void. Alone, but not entirely. They could still feel the weight of the ship's curse pressing on them. Suddenly, the ship jolted violently. The console beeped erratically as the systems flickered on and off. Panic surged through the protagonist's veins as they tried to steady the controls. But it was no use. The ship was out of control. The engines sputtered, cutting in and out, and the once smooth flight became a chaotic series of jolts and spins. "What the hell is happening?" the protagonist muttered, their voice barely a whisper over the roar of the malfunctioning engines. They tried to regain control, but the systems were glitching, flickering in and out of operation. The entire ship groaned, as though something deep within it had awakened and was now pushing back. Then, without warning, the lights went out completely, plunging the ship into darkness. The protagonist's breath caught in their throat. Silence fell, and the only sound was the distant thrum of the engines, still struggling to stay alive. They fumbled for a flashlight, their hands shaking as they finally found it. The beam of light illuminated the interior of the cockpit. Empty, cold. The instruments blinked with warnings, but nothing made sense. Everything seemed to be malfunctioning, as if the ship was fighting against them. And then it happened. A noise, distant at first, but growing louder. A low, guttural growl that seemed to echo from somewhere far behind them. It wasn't the sound of malfunctioning equipment. It was something else, something far worse, something alive. The protagonist froze, the blood draining from their face. They slowly turned in their seat, scanning the empty space around them. The growl grew louder, closer. It wasn't coming from the ship. It wasn't even coming from space. It was coming from inside the ship. The walls of the cockpit seemed to stretch inwards, the temperature dropping suddenly. The cold air cut through them like a knife. The lights flickered again, this time briefly illuminating a figure in the corner of the room. A shape, hunched, with eyes that glowed an unnatural green. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat as they realized that they weren't alone. They hadn't escaped after all. The creature's eyes locked onto theirs, and in that moment, time seemed to stop. The protagonist could feel the weight of its gaze, like something much older, much more ancient than any being they had ever encountered. The growl became a hiss, low and deadly, as the creature slowly moved toward them. Its skin was translucent, revealing an intricate web of glowing veins beneath. The same strange bioluminescence that had pulsed in the alien ship now radiated from this creature, its movements smooth and deliberate. A cold chill swept over the protagonist as they scrambled to react. But their limbs were frozen. Terror had rooted them to the spot, and they could barely move. The creature was closer now, its breath slow and heavy, as it stood just a few feet away. The protagonist's mind raced. It couldn't be. How could it have followed them? How was this possible? The alien ship, they had thought they had escaped it. But now, the nightmare was not over. It had found a way to follow them. The protagonist had triggered something when they activated the refueling system. Perhaps the ship had transferred its consciousness, or worse, it had been feeding off them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The creature's jagged teeth glinted in the faint light, its smile twisted, mocking. The protagonist's fingers fumbled for the emergency eject button. They didn't care what happened next. They needed to survive, needed to escape. Just as they slammed their hand down on the eject button, the creature lunged forward with terrifying speed. But the moment it reached them, the world around the protagonist shattered. The ship exploded into a blinding flash of white light, and in that instant, the protagonist was thrown from their seat. The last thing they saw before everything went black was the ship's monitors, flashing with strange symbols, symbols that had started to glow in the same sickly green light as the creature. And then, nothing.